Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that focuses on some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also we explore their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. We're continuing on today with the theme Islam's Fault Line, and we're going to talk about a supremely interesting country in the Middle East. But before we do that, I want to remind you that the companion to the Some Stops Along the Way podcast is my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, available on Amazon. It goes into detail about some of the interesting people and experiences that I've had around the world during my uh, 25 or so years in international development. And I would be honored if you would read it. I think that if you're interested in international affairs, interested about exploring different cultures, you'll enjoy Some Stops Along the Way. Also, I've got several novels rather, available on Amazon, but I've got some that are relatively new that maybe you haven't heard of yet. One of them is called The Little Girls. This is set in Jerusalem. It is a multi generational novel about the friendship of three women of different faiths who live in the old city of Jerusalem. And I think that you will like it very much. Hope you will give it a read. Also, The Bacon Boys. The Bacon Boys is a novel that is born out of a group that I was actually in Afghanistan called the Bacon Boys. And there's a backstory to that you can read in the book. But this is a work of fiction that I believe will really resonate with you about multi generations of men coming together to form a bond and to give an homage to heroes who have departed. The Bacon Boys. Hope you'll give it a read. And finally, a novel that I am very, very passionate about, and that is The Ghost of Mariupol. I began writing this while I was in Ukraine. It is about the war in Ukraine, but it is a story that I think will resonate with a lot of people. So I'd be honored if you would check it out. They're all on Amazon, and along with my other novels, so you can take a look at those when you get the chance. Right now, though, we want to move on with our discussion of another country that I think you're going to find fascinating, and that is the country of Syria. When I think about Syria, a lot of emotions come into play. When the Syrian war began, I was actually living in Amman, Jordan. And I never had the chance to work in Syria extensively. But one of the things that I always wanted to do was to go not for work, but just on holiday to explore this ancient country. But, life takes over, work took over. And even though I was in Amman, which is just a few hours away from the Syrian capital of Damascus, I was always busy and put it off and always had other places to go and never went really for holiday to explore the richness of the country of Syria. And I regret that because in putting it off, the war began and then everything changed in Syria. Damascus, Aleppo, other very historic cities in Syria were just eviscerated during this war. And it's very easy to look back and play the woulda, coulda, shoulda game. But the fact is that the trend in Syria was moving in the wrong direction for a long period of time. And as a post conflict specialist, I should have seen that trend. There were a lot of reasons for it, but I think that if you tie it back to Arab Spring, which we've talked about on a different episode, the the beginning of the end for Syria is when Muslim extremism started to take hold in the country, especially ISIS. And it was this vacuum of war that created this the the recipe, if you will, for the rise of Islamic extremism. It was always there under the surface. But the chaos created by war really gave this this extremism roots, if you will. I remember standing in a shop in Amman with Debbie one day, and we were looking at a lot of the beautiful art and handicrafts that are produced in that area of the world. And I noticed a table that had inlaid stones, and it was absolutely a beautiful hand carved wooden table that had it was lacquer and had inlaid stones, as I said, gorgeous. And I decided I want this table, and so I started talking to the shopkeeper, and he was very transparent. He said, "I'd love to sell you this table. It's a very beautiful table, but you need to know it's not Jordanian; it's actually Syrian." And I said, "Really?" And he went into detail with me the history of the furniture industry in Syria and how hand carved pieces like this were really part of the Syrian motif, if you will, in furniture. I did buy the table, it sits in my house today. And every time I look at it, I think fondly of that story, but there's also a twinge of sadness about the Syrian people, and that I couldn't do more to help in rebuilding that country because I was assigned elsewhere at the time, and it was just not possible for me to go long term to Syria. But even so, the work that I was doing in that region, in Jordan, in Israel and Palestine, and other places, was indelibly connected with what was going on in Syria. So I had to become a student of what was happening around me and in that region. And Syria played a huge role in that. And so I want to delve into it today. And if I could characterize Syria with a phrase, I would say it this way: Syria is a country that remembers everything. Stay with me and I'll get to that point. You see, you don't arrive in Syria. You descend into it, into layers, layers of empire, of memory, of wounds that haven't healed, and some that maybe never will. When you when you stand in the old city of Damascus, especially just before dawn, the alleys are still, the stones are older than most countries. The call to prayer rises like a thread pulled through centuries. You feel the weight of the place that has seen everything: prophets, conquerors, poets, merchants, soldiers, refugees, and the quiet resilience of ordinary people who keep living together through whatever history throws at them. Regrettably, my time in that old city was largely post war. So I didn't get to see it as it had been before. And that's one of the biggest regrets of my career. You see, Syria is not just a country, it's a palimpsest, a manuscript written, erased, rewritten, burned, and written again. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about the layers of Syria's evolution, its history, its culture, its government, its geopolitical position, and of course, the war that tore it apart. The war whose shockwaves still shape the Middle East and which shaped much of the work that I did in that region. Let's start by looking at the deep roots that Syria had before its modern state. Ancient Syria is one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions on Earth. Aleppo and Damascus both claim to be the oldest cities still alive. This land saw an amalgamation of tribes and people groups throughout its history. The Amorites, the Aramaeans, the Phoenicians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines. And every empire left something behind: a road, a ruin, a word, a recipe, a rhythm. Of course, you can't talk about Syria's history without talking about the Islamic Golden Age. Under the Umayyads, Damascus became the capital of the first great Islamic empire. The city was the beating heart of the world, stretching from Spain to India. During the Ottoman Empire, for 400 years, Syria was a province. It was diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and deeply connected to trade routes. But it was also fragmented. Aleppo, Damascus, Homs, Hama, and the coastal cities each had their own identities. And of course, after the Ottomans came the French. After World War I, the French carved Syria into pieces, sometimes literally. They created separate states for the Alawites, the Druze, and the cities. These divisions planted the seeds that would matter later on. I've covered thousands of years of Syrian history in just a few minutes. But I really want us to focus on this episode on the more modern state of Syria. After World War I, the French, as I said, carved Syria into pieces. And this laid the foundation for instability later on. Syria gained its independence in 1946. And the next 2 decades were absolute chaos. There were coups, there were counter coups, there were short-lived parliaments, and there were ideological battles between Arab nationalists, socialist, Islamist, and military factions. And this gave rise to one of the most powerful political forces in the region, and that is the Ba'ath Party. In 1963, the Ba'ath Party seized power. It promised Arab unity, socialism, and anti-imperialism. In practice, it became a vehicle for military rule. And with the rise of the Ba'ath Party came the rise of Hafez al-Assad. In 1970, al-Assad, an Alawite officer, took control, and he reshaped Syria. He reshaped it into a powerful security state, a cult of stability, a carefully managed sectarian balance. And he shaped it around a foreign policy built on strategic patience. He crushed the Muslim Brotherhood uprising in Hama in 1982. But that's a trauma that would echo decades later. Following him was his son, Bashar al Assad. You see, Hafez died in 2000, and his son Bashar, who was a London trained ophthalmologist, took over. Syrians hoped for reform, and for a moment there was openness to reform, the Damascus Spring, if you will. But the old guard shot it down. By 2011, Syria was a pressure cooker. And we're going to, in just a few moments, talk more about what happened when this pressure cooker exploded. But to really understand that, how this pressure cooker situation evolved, you need to understand something about the culture of Syria and the mosaic of its peoples and traditions. You see, Syria doesn't have one identity. Syria is a mosaic of Sunni Arabs, Alawites, Christians, Druze, Kurds, Armenians, Turkmen, and Circassians. The diversity is not a footnote. It's actually the country's DNA. Pardon me, the country's DNA. When I was in Jordan, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, Jordan was a artificially created country, and it is populated largely by Palestinians, many of whom were relocated from their traditional homes in Israel and Palestine. But Syria, from the beginning, because it was on a natural trade route, was populated by numerous ethnicities and groups and went through many iterations of cultural overlays. And this created different areas of focus around the country culturally. For instance, Damascus is about poetry and jasmine. Oh, the jasmine smell in Damascus. When I could still smell, I can't anymore. That's another story. But Aleppo has the music and the cuisine. Homs is the humor. Hama is the tradition. The coast is the Alawite heartland. The northeast is Kurdish and tribal. Syrian food is legendary, absolutely legendary. Especially the Alpine cuisine, which is a type of Syrian food. But their poetry, their hospitality, it's all part of the Syrian mosaic. And what is interesting is that even in the middle of war, Syrians kept cooking, they kept singing, they kept telling stories. Their culture became their resistance. We knew so many Syrian refugees in Jordan who desperately clung to their culture, who wanted to go home. But until they could go home, they wanted to preserve their culture, whether it was their food, their music, their poetry, their sense of humor, whatever it was. And we came to value those people and really respect and love them very much. And our hearts went out to them for the situation that they were in. So the culture of Syria became the glue that held it together. If anything held it together as it was starting to break apart, the sinews that kept it from totally flying in every direction was the culture. But at the very nexus of the troubles that befell Syria, beginning around 2011, although the seeds were planted much earlier, was the government itself. You see, Assad put a system in place when he took over the government. The country's officially a republic, But in practice, it's a personalist authoritarian state built on a combination of the presidency, the Ba'ath Party, the security services, and a network of loyalists from the Alawite community. When we talk about the security state in Syria, it was one of the most feared in the entire region. It was called the Mukhabarat, the intelligence services, and it was the backbone of the regime. They monitored, intimidated, and enforced al Assad's policies, and they were ruthless about it. Before the war, the regime managed to function even in an authoritarian way because it provided stability, subsidies, jobs, and secularism. And in return, Syrians tended to stay out of politics. However, this contract collapsed in 2011. Roughly corresponding with this tsunami that started in Tunisia with Arab Spring. So, what were the origins of the Syrian war? Well, certainly the foundation of that was this combination of an authoritative government, the rise of fundamentalist Islamic forces, and this multi-ethnic culture that was all aggregated together within the confines of Syria. But everything like this starts with a spark. And in March 2011, teenagers in Dara spray painted anti-government graffiti. They were arrested and tortured. Protests erupted. The regime responded with force. Funerals became protests. Protests became clashes. And these clashes ultimately became war. So why did Syria explode? Well, from this initial spark in March 2011, several forces converged to create the flying apart of Syria as we know it. One was drought and economic hardship. The country was seeing very challenging economic times. People continued to get poorer. The rains weren't coming. The crops weren't growing. People were in a desperate situation. And it seemed that the al-Assad government was almost invisible in trying to help them. It's almost that they didn't acknowledge that this was even going on. Plus, corruption and inequality continued. Now, corruption and inequality had happened under the Ba'ath Party leadership since the beginning. Certainly since 1970 when al-Assad took over. But it became magnified because of these other factors like the drought and economic hardship that converged. Syria also had a young population with no political outlet. And they were very connected to the world, so they could see what was happening in Tunisia, in Libya, and throughout the Middle East. And they were angry. They were angry at the fact that they didn't see a future for themselves and their families. They were angry at the fact that they had no political voice. They were angry at the fact that their friends had been arrested and tortured. And it was like the first domino to fall in the implosion of Syria. Sectarian tensions also factored into this. They'd been there the entire time. But again, when the economy was stable and Syrians tended to stay out of politics, the sectarian tensions weren't as pronounced, especially since there was an egregious authoritative network that would squelch any opposition. And regional rivalries came into play as well. Well, throughout 2011, from March on, things began to get worse. And by 2012, Syria fractured completely. You had a number of forces coming together that created this fracture. You had the Al Assad regime and the Ba'ath Party. You had the Free Syrian Army. You had Islamist factions. You had Kurdish factions. You had ISIS. And this civil war began to tear apart the country. Cities became battlefields. Homs, Aleppo, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor. They were laid into ruins. And chaos ensued. And as I said before, when chaos ensues, this allows for one or more groups to step in and fill the gaps because people are desperate for stability. We saw this in Afghanistan, where a series of wars created such instability that the people were willing to accept the Taliban, who offered stability, even though it turned out to be a horrible regime. The same was true in Syria with the rise of ISIS. ISIS exploited the chaos. First, it seized Raqqa and declared it to be a caliphate and drew global attention. The U.S. and its allies intervened. Kurdish forces became America's key partners. And of course, along with ISIS, you had foreign intervention as well, because Syria became a proxy war. Iran backed Assad with militias and advisors. Hezbollah fought on the regime side. Russia intervened in 2015, which finally turned the tide. Turkey targeted Kurdish forces and backed the rebels. Gulf states supported various opposition groups. Pardon me. And the U.S. focused on alleviating ISIS. So no one was really fighting in the best interest of the Syrian people, or to preserve the culture and the history, and to change the geopolitical system in Syria. Instead, the internationals were fighting their own proxy wars to achieve their own ends and to develop their own agendas. In essence, Syria was no longer a war. It was a battlefield for other people's wars. And the human cost was absolutely staggering. Over 500,000 dead, more than 6 million refugees, another 6 million displaced internally. Entire cities were destroyed. Much of the beautiful ancient architecture in cities like Aleppo and Damascus was imploded. But none of this captures the grief. The families that were separated, the homes that were lost, the futures that were erased. As I said, I was living in Jordan at the time. We saw firsthand the refugee crisis. In fact, Syria's refugees reshaped not just Jordan, but also Lebanon, Turkey, and to a larger degree, Europe. They changed politics, economies, and demographics. But one thing that is not often discussed in the context of the Syrian war was the Iran-Israel shadow war. This was the war before the war. We all know what's happening now in Iran, between Iran and Israel. But before that, there were a lot of proxy battles going on, if you will. And Iran's presence in Syria brought Israel into the conflict through airstrikes. Syria became the front in a larger regional struggle. And then, of course, you had the Kurds. The Kurdish Autonomous Zone in the northeast Rojava, became a geopolitical flashpoint involving Turkey, the United States, and the Assad regime. It facilitated Russia's return to the Middle East. It used Syria to reassert itself as a global power. Remember what happened in Afghanistan, the crushing embarrassment to the Russians when they were really forced out of Afghanistan by tribal fighters in the hills with Stinger missiles and automatic weapons. The Syrian war became Moscow's proving ground. And this is where they really, after the occupations in the Republic of Georgia in the 2008 timeframe, this is when Russia really began to stretch its muscles. And this war could have emboldened Russia, could have empowered Russia, could have served as a proving ground for what came later in Ukraine. So, what's the legacy of the war? Well, one of the legacies is that it left Syria practically destroyed. Its infrastructure, its industry, its agriculture, all of it was shattered. And the really catastrophic thing about it is that it's a frozen conflict because the war is not over. It's simply quieter. You may not know, but today Syria is divided into zones. The regime holds the west, the Kurds hold the northeast, the rebels hold the northwest, and the Turkish control the border areas. So you might ask, well, through all of this, how did the regime survive? Well, believe me, people who have a lot of years in international development have asked the same thing. Assad remains in power, not because he won, but because he outlasted. Now, he has lost control of large swaths of the country. So it's certainly not the regime of old. He has, Bashar al-Assad, for all intents and purposes, has been rendered almost toothless. Without the support coming in from outside, the al-Assad regime and possibly the Ba'ath Party as a whole would crumble. But as of today, the Ba'ath Party and al-Assad still control at least part of the country, although in a very, very weakened state. But this whole war has really created a lost generation. Millions of Syrian children have grown up in war and continue to be in war today. Others have fled the country, either for Jordan or Turkey, other places in the Middle East, Europe. And that's changed the demographics of those countries. Pardon me. So the trauma from this war continues. And that leads to the question of return. Pardon me. That leads to the question of return. The fact is that most refugees can't return. Not safely, not yet. Because the war continues to go on. It is not palatable for most of those who fled the country, most of those refugees, to return. And all of these have created a long shadow that clouds the region far outside of Syria. You see, the Syrian war reshaped regional alliances mitigation patterns, counterterrorism strategies, the balance of power in the Middle East. Its legacy will last literally for generations. And yet, Syria still exists. It refuses to disappear. One of my biggest hopes is that one day I'll walk again through the old city of Damascus. And much of what I had hoped to see, the ancient part of the city, will be gone or will be reconstructed. But the stones will still be there. The jasmine will still bloom. The people will still endure. Because Syria is wounded, it's fractured, it's exhausted, but it's not erased. And certainly the spirit of the people has been damaged, but not erased. They're still cooking their beautiful meals, their flavorful meals. They're still singing. They're still telling stories. They're still clinging with everything they have to a culture that they refuse to let go extinct. Because you see, Syria remembers everything and it survives everything. Survival in Syria is not just an instinct, it's an identity. Wow. There's so much more I could say about Syria, but I don't really know what's left to say because the identity of Syria now, regrettably, the modern identity of Syria is tied to this war. A war that could have been averted, a war that the factors of which many had seen coming for years and just didn't address it. And when they were not addressed, they became the toxic cocktail with the spark from Arab Spring and this March 2011 incident that I discussed that unraveled the thread of the country. The thread was already there, but those events pulled that thread and unraveled the country. But let's all hope that one day we'll have the opportunity, if not together, then separately, to visit this beautiful country in peace and explore what's been lost, but also see firsthand a future that will be not just endured, but rebuilt by the Syrian people. Thanks for joining some stops along the way. I'm sorry I have a little bit of a cold, so forgive my coughing fits this morning, but I hope you got something out of the podcast. I hope you'll join us again next Monday when we'll jump into the fascinating country of Qatar. Until then, have a great week and see you next time on some stops along the way.